kind of like you have a hard time thinking clearly. So if you answer yes probably to 5 or 6 or more of these questions, you would definitely have a serious yeast problem. Next. Now, the current theory and practice, this is 2 different approaches to dealing with something like yeast infections. And the current theory and practice that deals with almost the way everybody approaches this kind of thing is to kill all the different infectious organisms that are invading the body. But the natural approach to infection is different. Natural approach is to focus on enhancing the body's own defenses via improved immune function and balanced biological terrain. In other words, the yeast gets out of control because the terrain of the body is not correct. So it creates an environment for the yeast to grow and take over. Just taking stuff to kill the yeast is never going to permanently resolve the problem with yeast infections. You have to alter the terrain. And tonight, like I said, I'm going to be presenting some really recent information I got that really validates why this second approach is so important. So next slide. It has to do with understanding microbes. Now, I spoke at a probiotics symposium in Salt Lake in November, and one of the people who spoke was a medical doctor, Stephen Olmsted, who's into natural medicine, and he talked about the concept of biofilm, which is what I'm going to introduce to you. And what he explained is that microbes don't live in nutrient-rich petri discs and flasks, okay? That's not the way microbes normally exist in the environment. So what he said is our current methods of studying microbes and how to combat them don't actually reflect how microbes live and interact with us. Next slide. Microbes basically produce something called biofilm, and that's a picture of a biofilm of Staphylococcus. And biofilms are communities that consist of one or, in many cases, several species of bacteria or fungus. Next slide. So what this shows is this is a slide from the internet showing the development of biofilm. Now what happens is you start off with a few individual microbes, and then of course if you got a few of those microbes into a nutrient-rich petri dish, okay, they'd start forming little colonies. They'd start dividing, and you'd get little clusters of bacteria, which is what you see growing in a petri dish. However, what happens in the real environment is as microbe colonies grow to a certain size, they start excreting these little filaments of material that are composed of complex polysaccharides and proteins, and actually form like bacterial kind of high-rise. They literally create an ecosystem for themselves in which they have little channels that can allow nutrients to flow into the area, and they start acting like they're one organism rather than a whole bunch of single-celled organisms. It's almost like they're creating a more complex structure. And you see that in stage 4 when they have a whole community called biofilm. And then at some point when the community gets big enough, part of that biofilm will break off and individual bacteria will be released to go colonize elsewhere. Next slide. So here's some examples of biofilm, okay? You know that plaque that grows on your teeth that the dentist scrapes off? That is biofilm, okay? And the part of the reason why microbes develop this biofilm is just rinsing your mouth with an antibacterial mouthwash does not destroy the microbes living in the biofilm. Part of the reason they create the biofilm is it forms a protective barrier between them and the environment so that they can actually ward off antibiotics or antifungals or things that would harm them. Now, if you pull up a root of a plant, you'll see that that there's often this like very white, fine material coating the roots of plants. Well, this is actually a biofilm of microbes that are attached to the roots of the plants, and they live in symbiotic relationship with the plants, breaking down nutrients and making them bioavailable to the plants and getting benefits from the plants. Pond scum and our intestinal microbes form biofilm. In other words, they colonize the mucous membranes of our intestinal tract and basically form a coating that literally coats the entire thing and forms a symbiotic relationship between, just like that film on the roots of the plants, between our intestinal wall and the environment. Next slide. Now in the soil, remember I mentioned those little things, these things coexist called mycorrhiza, which live symbiotically with plants. Myco is fungal and rhiza is root, and they live partially in the plant root hairs and partially in the soil. So the roots supply the mycorrhiza with carbohydrates, and the mycorrhiza supply the plants with nutrients and moisture. Well, the same thing is happening, you see, with the friendly bacteria in our intestines. Our intestines are like, in our body, the equivalent to the plant's roots. And the microbes growing on them create the same kind of symbiotic relationship with us. Next slide. So here's why this is so important to our understanding about how to fight yeast infections and so forth. Microbes living in biofilms are different than free-floating microbes. Biofilm organisms cooperate to defend themselves against disinfectants and antibiotics, phagocytes, and even our own immune system. And this really helps you understand the problem of recurring infections, yeast infections, bladder infections, ear infections, urinary infections, sinus infections, and so forth. Basically what you do is you take that antifungal remedy and it goes down and it kills all the free-floating Candida. And you feel better for a little while. But because a lot of the ones that are growing in a Candida biofilm basically are protected, 2 or 3 weeks later, boom, it's back again. Next slide. Oh, went backwards, gotta go forward. Here we go, one more. So, the biofilm is a gathering of one or more species. Oops, back up, went too far. Biofilm is a gathering of one or more species of permanently attached microbes. So these are microbes are permanently attached to the surface they're on. And they're encased in a self-produced matrix of hydrated exopolysaccharides, that's complex sugars. These are crisscrossed with microchannels that allow nutrient and water flow. And the organisms, basically just like our cells, talk to each other with chemical messengers. They talk to each other, cooperate, and communicate for protection. Next slide. So our intestinal biofilm is practically a separate organ in our body and contains about 100 trillion microbes. Its metabolic activity rivals the metabolic activity of the liver, which is the most complex biochemical organ in our body. And it forms a colonization-resistant barrier to infection. Now that's the point. A healthy biofilm in your intestinal tracts is like a barrier. It creates a terrain in which yeast and other harmful microbes cannot get through, because it is basically creating a protective barrier through your digestive tract.